about what the government is saying, what the opposition is saying, what independent commentators are saying, experts are saying, inside Barbados and outside of the country. And sir, for me this afternoon, I want to make some critical observations regarding the estimates that are attached to the appropriations bill that we are debating this afternoon. And I say critical observations, and sir, from the outset, I want to say not critical objections, critical observations, Mr. President. Sir, when I take a step back and I listen to all that has been said so far about the Barbadian economy, I reflect on the fact and come to the position where I believe, Mr. President, Barbados in a 21st century reality is a country at odds with itself. That is my perception of where we are, Mr. President. Mr. President, when we went through the social transformation of granting free education, that was a catapult in development. When we had the transfer of lands to working class Barbadians through the Tenantries Freehold Act, that was another catapult in development. And sir, what I see when I look at the landscape is that we are unable to identify a set of values that anchor us in a collective, philosophical, ideological, and developmental position. Sir, and without understanding what our value system is, we are unable then to shape our political and social identity. And that therefore spills out into our attempts for economic transformation. Sir, that is what my perception is, and I call it the development dilemma that we face. The development dilemma that we face as a small, open, vulnerable economy in the 21st century. But Mr. President, before I further develop that main point, I want to get in to the weeds of the estimates. I want to get into the weeds. I want to get into the details where they say the devil hides, Mr. President. Sir, the Prime Minister announced that there were going to be no new taxes to date, but further adjustments, she rightly said, will have to be made later down in the year. And Mr. President, that is on the backdrop of the government already intending to run on a cash basis a deficit of $1.069 billion. That is cash in hand. That is based on the Accountant General. $1 billion to round it up. Sir, that is an increase based on the estimates of $75 million, revised estimates from last year. The revised estimates from last year, and even more alarming, Mr. President, when I make a comparison between what we approved last year in this place, which was a deficit of $84,844 million, as opposed to what is now in this year's estimates, 2024 to 2025, somehow there's an approved estimate deficit of $932 million. And I asked, where are these discrepancies coming from? Because we sat in this chamber and we approved $854 million projected deficit. How is it then that the approved estimates for last year, in this year's estimates, is $932 million. That is a query that I have. I don't know if it's a procedural error. I'm not sure. I don't know if it is. I'm just asking the question, how did we approve one thing last year, yet in this year's estimates, there's a different amount, and that is an increase of $225 million, a difference of $225 million. And sir, I'll tell you why that is even more concerning for me. Sir, the fiscal deficit on, again, a cash basis, in 2021 to 2022 was $1.1 billion in the height of Barbados going through multiple crises. We hear about it all the time. We were going through COVID, we had the hurricane, there was ashfall, freak storm, and all the other things we had to deal with at that period of time. And in that time period, Mr. President, we had a deficit of $1.1 billion. So then, if we are recovering, the economy is buoyant, how are we then running still a deficit this financial year of $1 billion? We have to rationalize and reconcile, because we have to rationalize and reconcile. Because if on one hand we say the economy is growing and we're doing well, and it is government's intention to reduce total national debt, we have to wrestle with how we reduce our fiscal deficits. Because people get confused sometimes with the word fiscal deficit and national debt. The fiscal deficit, sir, is in relation to the difference between revenues earned and expenditure in government operations. The national debt is all of government's liabilities in relation to the loans that they've incurred, most of the time, to finance the deficit. Sir, I also want to bring to the Chamber's attention, because the government knows me for reading things that sometimes I probably shouldn't see. The current expenditure, Mr. President, for this year, current government expenditure for this year is increasing by 11%. Okay, that's a manageable, marginal increase, by my estimation. But sir, I want to bring the Chamber's attention and those that are listening to me to a line item. And the line item's title is Statutory Investment Expenses. That is increasing, Mr. President, by, and I'll read it out for you. It's increasing by 8,184%. It is moving from $500,000 to $41 million. And I asked the question, what is that $40 million for? I know the government is going to embark on numerous projects. Is this a standalone project? And the fact that it is called statutory investment expense places a question mark on that $40 million. I'm sure the government will have some explanation as to that large increase, Mr. President, but I am just raising it here. And I will come back to this idea about having expenditures listed. The leader of government business noted this morning in relation to the commitment to results. And I'm very pleased to hear about that. But we have a long way to go in building out transparency in this estimates process, Mr. President. Sir, still looking at expenditure, let's go to the debt service. So the debt service expenditure is expected to be 35%, a third, almost a third of total expenditure. Again, at $1.6 billion. And that is up from last year at $1.3 billion, an increase of $237, Mr. President. And I know some will say the counter to that is when the government came into office, the debt was 68 cents on the dollar. It is now around 30 cents on the dollar. And I take that point. But there is still, sir, an upward trend as it relates to both interest payments and amortization payments. Mr. President, the interest payments for this year allocated, the funds allocated for interest payments this year have increased by $79 million to $773 million. Amortization payments have increased by $155 million to $817 million. And I want to point out, on the backdrop of those increases, last year, in the revised estimates, we paid more in interest payments than paying back on principal. It was a marginal increase, one or the other. Last year, we paid $693 million in interest payments, and we paid $662 million in principal. We broke the threshold in relation to how much we are paying in fees attached to the money that we've borrowed than actually paying back the money that was given to us in terms of loan payments. And those are the things, Mr. President, while we have the discussion in the back and forth, those types of trends, if a small open economy starts to pay more in interest payments in relation to and relative to its amortization payments, there must be caution. There must be caution, Mr. President. Sir, I want to turn now to how government is intending to finance the deficit. Last year, Mr. President, we had a deficit of $925 million. 80% of that was financed by foreign financing. $740 million to be exact. The most of that money came from the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the IMF. The other 20% came from local sources. Government this year is actually shifting the financing structure for the deficit that we're anticipating it will run. This year, 60% of that $1 billion is expected to come from local financing, and 40% is expected to come from foreign financing, Mr. President. So what the government is anticipating is it's going to shift the heavy borrowing from external sources, and it is coming to the local market for looking for over 600, I believe the number is $632 million. 628, I'm being corrected. Thank you, Senator Walker, for that clarification. $628 million is expected to raise from the local market. And even though we're saying the economy, sir, has been improving, we still have a local market that does not have a ready appetite for government securities. Why? Because of the fallout from the debt restructuring, sir, that we heard about this morning. That is still being felt by many persons across Barbados, and to the high cost of living. If you do not have the disposable income to feed your family and pay bills and do everything else, where are you going to get the financing, Mr. President, or the disposable income to invest in government securities? So the government has to take these things on board and be mindful, because if the anticipation is that it's going to shift where the financing is coming from, and it wants to rely on the local market, if it is unable to, we revert back to being heavily financing our deficit from foreign sources, Mr. President. Sir, I listened to the Prime Minister as she delivered the budgetary proposals. And there were many things that she covered in that presentation. And I do think sometimes that I even make myself smile. The Prime Minister, in her 4-hour-long speech, spoke to inflation, according to my watch, between 6:10 p.m. and 6:14 p.m. 4 minutes. If you walk around in this country, Mr. President, the number one issue is cost of living. The number one issue is cost of living, Mr. President. And I want to make a plea on behalf of two sections in this society this afternoon, because very little or none at all in terms of attention was paid to them. And this is in relation to the cost of living. So the first plea that I have is a reduction of income tax for those in the tax band between $25,000 to $75,000 a year, what we call the quote-unquote middle class. Mr. President, that's persons earning between $2,500, just about, and $6,000 per month. Mr. President, we cater to the vulnerable. They have the welfare programs to depend upon. The rich will survive. But the middle class in this country are feeling it. They are feeling it, Mr. President. And these are the individuals who are either first or second generation university graduates. They've done the right thing. They've educated themselves. They have a trade. They've built businesses. Mr. President, there is no reprieve for them. There is no reprieve for them. Mr. President, these are the types of people that, because they may earn the highest amount in their family, they're paying their water bills and their family's water bills. They're sending school their children, Mr. President. They're paying their own medical bills, Mr. President. They're not relying on the public service. Their disposable income has been eroded tremendously due to the inflationary effects post-COVID. And it seems as though they're the silent ones who are to carry the burden of the country. And I say, sir, that is unjust, because they've bear the brunt for a long, long time. They need breathing room as well, Mr. President, because, as I said, they don't qualify for welfare, and they don't have large savings. Many of them are one paycheck away from having no clue where they can sleep, how they can pay their mortgage, if they got a car to drive, how they can buy food. They have no clue, one paycheck away. They are relying on that paycheck every single month, the middle class. And sir, I say there must be a way for the government to give them breathing room. Sir, on the backdrop of adjustments to come, which will affect everyone, and it will affect those in that middle class, I am asking if the government cannot relook the personal income tax between that tax bracket, that first taxable income bracket that goes up to $75,000 a year. Mr. President, it is now at 12.5%. And because we have changed the structure of the tax regime for companies, and the government is anticipating $300 million more from corporate income tax, 300 million or so. Why can we not see a reduction in the personal income tax that will directly affect their ability to see money in their hands? Whether it's 2%, 1%, I am telling you, it will make a difference. They are carrying too much load, Mr. President. If you shifted getting revenue, more revenue from the corporations, you're anticipating more revenue from the corporations. If the amount coming from those in the middle class can be reduced, that the net effect is neutral, then do it. Then do it. And I don't understand how this was overlooked. Somebody is not talking to the right people. Somebody is not talking to the right people. Look at your policies and see where you can give reprieve in the middle class. That you have to. Mr. President, the second plea that I have, and I can try not to get emotional here. Sir, picture this. Not Sicily, Barbados, 2024. You are telling persons, please, save for your retirement. This is the right thing to do. As a good law-abiding citizen, we want you to put some money aside for your retirement. Okay, you do that. You do that, Mr. President. When you go to your insurer, the person who is providing you your pension, that you have diligently put your little nest egg aside because this is the fixed income you're going to live off of, and you can hope that if you got children, they mind you, and so on. So you're relying on this money. You get to the meeting with whoever the pension provider may be, and they say to you, oh, yes, you are eligible to take your funds out. However, if you want 100% of your voluntary contributions, that's the money you have put in, after you've been taxed on your income all your working life, the provider is going to tell you, well, if you want all of your money in a lump sum and you don't want the annuity payments, say you have a pension plan, let's say $50,000, $100,000. So you know how much the government is asking you to pay in taxes, withholding taxes? Do you know that amount, Mr. President? You're not of pensionable age, but I wonder if you know the amount, sir. Sir, it is 25%. A quarter of your money if you say, I want the lump sum. And it is the highest rate in the Eastern Caribbean, even if it has always been. It is wrong, Mr. President. It is wrong. I am talking about private pensions, Mr. President. Private pensions. On top of that, the government was gracious last year and increased the tax that is applied to pensions, moving that amount from $40,000 to $45,000. Gracious enough. We get a little increase there, Mr. President. But when you start to break down what is over and above $45,000 a year, and sir, that applies if the pension is coming from a local source or international. So the persons coming in from overseas, from England, who work hard, as they say, work hard in the cold, when they come home and their pension is over £1,481, Mr. President, you got to pay taxes on it. You have to pay taxes on it, Mr. President. Sir, at that rate, we are talking about $3,700 a month in Barbados dollars. People who get that type of pension are not highfalutin hey, come lately people. You know who has that type of pension, Mr. President? Headmistresses and headmasters, senior people sometimes in the civil service, people who would have been in management positions, management level positions. They were the first ones to go to school at tertiary education in their family. Those are the type of people that have received that type of pension, who paid taxes all of their working life. But somehow, the government is telling them, you've done the right thing, and I can further penalize you because you got to pay some more taxes on the pension. And even worse, with the demographic problem that we have, government still has not given back the tax allowance on private pension plans, so that the people who are currently working can get a little reprieve as well, but at least there's an incentive not just to rely on the NIS pension, but have their own private pensions, Mr. President. And I listened with bated breath, Mr. President, to see if those middle-class households and pensioners were going to be addressed in the budget. Because, Mr. President, when we talk about households, and I want to say this, an economy, the three main actors, the state, firms, and the household. Tell me how an economy is going to run if the households collapse. How are they going to run? How is the economy, how are you going to get the 4 to 5% growth if the bottom of the middle class falls out? Because there's no shoppers to go and buy anything. You certainly can't tax people who don't work. So how, Mr. President, we do not understand that there's a glaring exemption in terms of making direct interventions on how households, particularly those in the middle class, are surviving in Barbados. Those are my two pleas. I look forward to the government's response. Mr. President, staying in the details, and sometimes the weeds. It might be a nice garden, but sometimes they have some weeds. I want to move to a department that was mentioned this morning by the leader of government business. And I sat and I smiled because within the Prime Minister's office, there is this department called Commitment for Results Department, Head 13, Subprogram 34. And so I want to read to the Chamber and for Barbadians, what is the objective of this department? Sir, it says it facilitates the implementation of the commitment of results for the public service of Barbados, and it is allocated $1.6 million this year, up from $721,000, an increase, Mr. President, of around $894,000. And the bulk of that increase, Mr. President, is being allocated to operating expenses, $455,000, and professional services, $500,000. $500,000, Mr. President. Or what we would usually call the consultancies. Consultancies, Mr. President. Consultancies. Sir, and the leader of government business spoke about that department, but that department has been allocated funds, I believe it is from 2021 or 2022. So 2-3 years later, having been allocated funds, I don't know who works there, Mr. President. I do not know what are the results for the commitment for the commitment for results department. I don't know what are those results, Mr. President. Even in the schedules of personal emoluments, Mr. President, usually there is a line item that outlines how many people work in the department. I have a big question mark. No numbers allocated. How many people work in the department, Mr. President? I am seeing a number on the other side. The government will have to get up and call that number. But I don't know who works there, what is guiding the work that is being done in that department. But I want to say to the administration, when I made the plea, I believe, sir, when you first came, I think that was my first contribution when you were in this chair, and I spoke about the connection that needs to be met between expenditure and outcomes and objectives. If this department is to live up to its name and its objective, Mr. President, we have a process that the government itself implemented, well-intended, in the well. How is it then that this department was not the first department to come to say to Barbadians, this is how monies are being spent, these are the objectives that are identified based on these expenditures, this is where we are, these are the things that we have achieved, and these are the outstanding items. Sir, that department should be giving Barbados a broad overview of the nuts and bolts. What are the things that are important in terms of results for the public service? And then that entire process would work so much better. Because Barbadians would then understand these are the main critical objectives and deliverables, to use a word that was used earlier. And we would have a better understanding of where we are in terms of the efficacy of our public spending, Mr. President. But based on what the leader of government business said this morning, there clearly is a framework. I don't know who that's being communicated to. I understand the process of arriving at that framework and the reconstruction and the deconstructing and reconstructing, Mr. President. I understand that those types of details are confidential, they're internal matters. But how can we as a country have this type of department and nobody knows what are the results that are expected? It has to be more comprehensive and cohesive than what we're doing at the moment. And I think that this department, although, yes, it appears to be a small department, but it is fundamental to any administration going forward, and this one, in their quest to build trust in the Barbadian society as it relates to transparency, Mr. President. I am not looking at the asides because Senator Walker is troublesome this afternoon, Mr. President. He is troublesome. He is troublesome. But, sir, what is even more important in that exercise, in outlining those objectives, is outlining those objectives in the context of that broader development agenda. Where is the country going? What is the vision, Mr. President? Don't worry, I can come to that. I got the document. I have the document. But that is, I know what it is, but it is in terms of the dialogue and the communication with the public to feel that we are on a coherent path somewhere. Spelling it out very clearly, Mr. President. Sir, I want to come out of the details and take a step back. I want to come out of the details and take a step back now. Sir, there is a broader discussion, I think, that is critical about development, particularly as it relates to the agenda that the government has. And as I said when I started, from a critical observer position, there's a development dilemma in public policy. Sir, and for some, what I will speak about may be seen as esoteric, academic, too intellectual. But when the government has a set of objectives and ideas about what growth is supposed to be, what development is supposed to be, what sustainability is supposed to be, and where the ideas and the concepts for those policies come from, Mr. President, I think it is important to understand if we are getting ourselves entangled in contradictions. It is important we are not getting ourselves entangled in contradictions in public policy. And sir, for those who think that ideas do not matter, sir, I point to them, and my goodly senator, the goodly senator that is next to me will correct me if I'm going astray here. I point them, sir, to Proverbs 23:7. Proverbs 23:7. As a man thinketh, so he is. So if the ideas that you have are entangled when implemented, your actions will follow entangled, Mr. President. Sir, and I say that because it is important that we have a coherent understanding of our development policy. And I am going to point out this afternoon some areas where the contradictions are clear. The contradictions are clear, Mr. President, and what they do is they create tension in the society. They create tension, Mr. President. Sir, I want to say first off that if you read the government's policy documents, laudable objectives, they are laudable. It is the thing that environmentalists and sustainable development practitioners dream of. It is true. Sustainable and inclusive growth and development, that is what we hear about. We hear about resilient societies and people-centered approaches. And you get this warm, fuzzy feeling inside that the government has it right. They're on the right track. And you hear about the fast tracking of feed-in tariffs. You hear, sir, about the debt for nature swaps for marine conservation, sir, and you are so elated. And further yet, they set up the Barbados Environmental Sustainable Fund, using monies that you saved in the debt swap to finance conservation efforts. Laudable, Mr. President, laudable. Climate and pandemic clauses. And you say, wow, we are on the right track, Mr. President. Removal of duties on electric vehicles. This is the place to be. This is the place to live, Mr. President. Come to Barbados. That is what the government is proposing in its public policy. No, this is not sarcasm. These are the facts. These are your public policies, Mr. President. This is the government's public policies. And on the social side, we had a historic event. Based on the pronouncements of the goodly Senator Morris. We had historic events as it relates to the Labour Clauses Act being passed. So even on the social side, government is making sure that Barbados is a place where sustainable development is a real thing. It's a real thing, Mr. President. But sir, you take a step back and you look at the environment, you look at the society, that the government wants to implement these policies. What type of economy are we living in, doing business in? What type of society? What is the structure like? And where did the structure come from? What is it rooted in, Mr. President? Because for all intents and purposes, when you ask some social scientists, they will say, we're still on the plantation. The actors may have changed, the activities may have changed, but we still on the plantation. So you're moving in a direction very fast ahead, where you want to have this inclusive, resilient society, but on a plantation. Something is entangled there, Mr. President. Something is entangled there. Sir, and I'll show you how it plays out. The government, and rightly so, has said the economy must grow by 4 or 5%. That is what we are capable of doing. And I also agree. But in growing the economy by 4 to 5% year on year, have we thought about how conspicuous consumption in that 4 to 5% on the trade balance will affect the importation bill? Sir, Professor Norman Gervan calls this the tyranny of materialistic ideas of progress. Are we going to take that 4 to 5% of growth and just buy things, which then impacts the trade deficit, Mr. President? Because let us not forget, when we grow the pie, 80 cents on the dollar still goes to imports. So have we changed or intervened in a way in our society that when the economy grows, the social logic of consumerism allows us to really see the material effect of us not relying on foreign goods? That is a question that I ask. Sir, how, and I want to ask this question, how does the 4 to 5% growth exacerbate the tensions that exist between capital, labor, natural ecosystems, and our communities? Has anyone thought about that? Because, Mr. President, when we have a situation where the growth is coming from tourism primarily, that requires us to continue to over-urbanize our coastal lands. You are going to get tensions because I get in there. I didn't forget the coral reefs. Got Mr. President, then let me speak on. Mr. President, we have to ask these questions because there are real issues that we must contend with. Real issues that we have to contend with. Sir, this 4 to 5% growth is even as a primary indicator of progress. Primary indicator of progress. Because that's all we hear about. We hear about economic growth, economic growth, economic growth, and it is imperative. It is not true. It isn't, because there's a policy document called, Mr. President, a mission-oriented strategy for inclusive and sustainable economic growth for Barbados by Professor Mariana Mazzucato. I hope I got the name correct. I believe she was here on the invitation of the Prime Minister last year, Mr. President. And in that document, Mr. President, it says having economic growth as a primary metric is insufficient. Is insufficient. And I was happy to read these things. That's why I talk about when you read the public policy, you get the idea that Barbados is the place to be. This is the utopia out here in the Eastern Caribbean. On page 27, sir, of that document, it states a dashboard of economic and non-economic indicators and objectives can be used to monitor the success of each mission. There are 6 missions. The Prime Minister talks about them when she gets a chance. Rather than static single indicators like, what? Sir, gross domestic product. Rather than the single indicators like gross domestic product. The government has 6 missions. I don't know how many Barbadians know about these missions. There are 6 missions. The first is become a clean and beautiful large ocean state, and it goes on to become 100% sustainable by 2035. 2, transform Barbados into a country of active, involved citizens. 3, ensure that every Barbadian has equitable and reliable access to clean water and nutritious food that is affordable, Mr. President. Create a society that prioritizes wealth and happiness, and it then talks about 50% reduction in new cases of non-communicable diseases and a 50% reduction in crime. The 5th one is to empower and enfranchise all Barbadians, workers and families, and to reduce the rate of poverty by 50%. And the last one, Mr. President, number 6, transform Barbados to be a high-functioning, resilient society with seamless access to services and meaningful digital inclusion of all Barbadians. So those are the 6 missions. But all I walked away with, and any Barbadian listening to the process that happened during the estimates and the budgetary proposals is, we are growing the economy by 4 to 5% year on year. Although stating very clearly here, that is insufficient. Sir, and I ask, how then are we at the national level tracking those missions through a set of measures and indicators? How are we doing it? Is the commitment for results department, are they the ones responsible for coming up with those measures and those indicators? It's taken them a long time, 2-3 years. Well, is the Barbados Statistical Service going to be expanded to include a lot of these things that are being asked to be reported on? Because if you do not measure it, Mr. President, then again, the place by which you make a decision becomes a dilemma. It becomes entangled, Mr. President. It becomes entangled. Sir, an even more glaring of this dilemma regarding ideology about development is, again, by the government's own policy agenda, is to building a sustainable, resilient society and having a people-centered approach. And the goodly senator this morning, she mentioned, the honorable member mentioned this, but I'll go into a bit more detail, because the government is on a sustainable development agenda, but the governor of the central bank on March 11th, 2024, in an article in the Nation newspaper entitled, "Economic Trickle-Down Will Take Time," he says, economic growth takes a while to be felt in all sectors at all times. When an economy begins to grow, the first thing you will see is improvements in corporates, and the evidence is there. In that article, sir, he goes on to state that companies start to hire more persons, they start to do more work, and they start to invest more, and by hiring more persons, that trickle-down effect and hiring more persons refers to the trickle-down effect, Mr. President. And you know why that is problematic? Trickle-down effect, Mr. President, comes from a theoretical and ideological position of 20th century economics based on market-led capitalism that is exploitative of both people and nature. That is where trickle-down economics comes from. And it is problematic that we have a governor of the central bank referring to that type of economics in a context where the government is talking about sustainable development and resilient and sustainable economy, Mr. President. Because going back to the notion about ideas and how you make decisions, Mr. President, when the governor of the central bank, if based on what he is saying in this article, if his ideological position is based on 20th century economics, it is going to be in direct contradiction to the mandate of the type of 21st century economics that the government's public policy is based off of. And so to get into some very probably academic discussion, what the governor is talking about is orthodox economics, and what the government is talking about is what we call alternative or heterodox economics. Heterodox economics, where you are trying your best to understand how there's environmental degradation and inequality in your society and how you organize labor and capital, Mr. President, that allows people and nature to thrive. There is a big chasm between the two. Big chasm. Mr. President, and when we have those contradictions between ideologies, when you're faced with a crisis and you have the option between having persons allow cruise ships. That's my pet peeve, don't worry. Allowing persons to dock off our coastlines and to drop anchor and destroy millions of square meters of coral reef that acts as a barrier for coastal protection. It's a natural habitat, Mr. President. And it directly affects the amount of money that we can get in terms of the value from our fishing industry, Mr. President. That is when we start to see that a decision is being made on capitalist logic and the need for investment when the cruise ships come back, because that is what we were told. We are going to allow them to anchor off Barbados in the event that when the country opens back, our goodwill will increase the number of cruise ships coming to Barbados. But because we do not pay enough attention and we do not have the metrics for our natural capital, the decision is then made lopsided, even in the context of having public policy that is committed to sustainable development, Mr. President. Even in that context, Mr. President. Sir, when we look at, as I said, the establishment of and the building out of infrastructure in our tourism sector, and we take it to its logical conclusion. We're building out our tourism sector, so that is physical infrastructure that we're talking about in terms of investment coming to Barbados. And we're placing it along the coastline, expanding down to the South Coast. There's some persons I spoke to, sir, that said the one that is very near to the garrison, the high rise, Barbados even referring as offensive and blocking out the windows to the sea. So when we build those hotels in the notion, sir, from here, respectfully, how much time do I have? Okay, good. When we look at where we're going to get the growth from in the next couple of years, we have to ask ourselves, how does that physical development that we're seeking the economic growth from, how does that then align with preserving our natural and cultural heritage? How does it align with preserving our coastlines? How does it align with preserving beach access? How does it align with ensuring that Barbadians still have windows to the sea? How does it align, sir, with ensuring that there is still your natural assets on the coastline, Mr. President? Because, Mr. President, in a 21st century Barbados, we have to start enshrining the rights of citizens and non-human life and ecosystems in our laws. And they have to be enshrined in the face of development. Because I will ask the question, how do the residents of Six Men's, one of the few remaining authentic fishing villages in Barbados, how do they exercise a constitutional right to have a say in the development of the new hotel that is going up in Six Men's? How are they integrated constitutionally in that decision-making if there are grievances that they have that should affect the decision-making of that investment? How, sir, do the people who live in the St. Lawrence Gap area constitutionally have an intervening mechanism that preserves the Chapman wetland in the face of development of the proposed marina, Mr. President? How do the residents of St. Joseph ensure that they will have access to the gully in the future and that developers cannot block it? Sir, and this is the type of dilemma that I am talking about. And I will direct in this short space of time that I have to let the government know that in those sustainable, inclusive societies that you want, there are autonomous political mechanisms for citizens to engage directly with decision-making.
Honorable members on the other end, just tone it down, please. I can hear you.
There are direct mechanisms for citizens to engage in the political process. Sir, I was in a session recently, and an expert in social policy said, elections are not democracy. They said elections are not democracy. There needs to be, and the government would be surprised, you've started the process, you know. You have started the process, but what you have to do and go a step further is to make sure that what you consider parish speaks, what you consider local government through the Thorn Commission, what the Democratic Labour Party called constituency councils, those become independent, apolitical community interventions into the political process that act as a counter to the centralization of power. So well said. For the centralization of power that we have in the executive branch of government. That is where the next social revolution in Barbados will come from, Mr. President. It has to be through a political intervention where the people in their communities have a direct say about what happens in relation to the lands that they live around, the ecosystems that they live around, and towards the estimates, Mr. President, in relation to public financing. It has to come from there. And the government that is bold enough to relinquish power to those communities, that is the government that will catapult us into the next phase of our development, Mr. President. Because, Mr. President, and I will say this, and I will say this in wrapping up, Mr. President. I will say this, Mr. President. We live in a Barbados that has the unfortunate record, the unfortunate historical record of having been the first English colony to pass comprehensive slave codes in 1661. We have that unfortunate record. 1661, the slave codes was passed. Oh, well, he can correct me, he can stand on a point of elucidation, that's fine. But, Mr. President, that type of stain that comes from the having perfected the exploitative plantation economy must be healed. We have to identify, and I'm hoping that it comes through this process of constitutional reform, because that is where it should be happening. The constitutional reform should be a vibrant activity where we are having an introspective look, a comprehensive look. Don't worry about me. I have the privilege of speaking in here, Mr. President. I am answering the aside, sir, but I'm going to continue to speak to you this afternoon. I'm going to continue to speak to you. Where Barbadians start to wrestle with what is their identity and what is their value system and what flows from it in terms of a development philosophy and policy, Mr. President. Because, Mr. President, we can continue to tinker with the economy. But, Mr. President, unless we address these issues, and dare I say, come to Jesus moment? Yeah, fine. Come to Jesus moment about ourselves, Mr. President. Who are we in a 21st century Barbados and world, Mr. President? It has to be fundamentally about that type of process. And I hope that the government has taken note of some of the things that I've mentioned this afternoon. And I want to say to Barbadians directly now, through you, sir, advocate and agitate however you can to have autonomous ways that are independent of central government to be a direct political actor in the decision-making that happens in this country. Because, sir, every administration, one after the other, Mr. President, has been marred by controversy, allegations of corruption, and until those in the community have the constitutional right to be part of decision-making, the inclusive and sustainable economy and society that we are striving for will always fall back, sir, on the ideology of the plantation, Mr. President. I am obliged to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Senator Drakes. Who's next? Senator Honorable Chanda.
Mr. President, sir, I rise exactly at 1800 hours, 6 o'clock in the afternoon of what is Holy Week we are in. And I want to, first of all, lend my support to this debate because we are in a very serious time, and not only a serious time in terms of the debate itself, but the time in which our country finds itself in and the alignment of strange bedfellows. And we must bring clarity and refocus the debate in the interests of our fellow Barbadians. I would have heard the leader of the government business outline in very clear terms this morning what, to my mind, is the essence of the estimates and the tradition of the estimates in the interest not only of, as I said before in previous times, of Barbadians today, but how do we set out this country on a trajectory that puts us on a path that we can also protect future generations of Barbadians. And therefore, the role of government spending over the next financial year is a reflection of an economy that, one, is performing well. Two, an economy that is also transforming, an economy that is repositioning itself to meet domestic challenges, domestic opportunities, international challenges, and international opportunities, and also one that is trying to ensure that this small nation state, this large ocean state, can be a globally competitive country on behalf of our fellow Barbadians. And equally, it is also about ensuring that we are on a resilient growth path as we do so. We're not just trying to get growth for growth's sake, but as we grow, as we enlarge the pie, as it were, we want to build it on foundations and pillars that have a resilient framework for our people. And one equally, and I really want to treat to this, a growing economy, a resilient economy that is also built on fiscal prudence. And I see Senator Rogers look at me as soon as I said fiscal prudence, because I know that between 2008 and 2018, those two words were not synonymous with his party. And I understand. Oh, we will talk about that, honorable member. Senator Walters. But you see, I understand why the honorable member, the fact that he looked up, because he's now in the honorable chamber having to listen and to potentially debate a bit later, whilst his leader in the Senate has walked out of the chamber. She is not interested, similar to what took place in the other place earlier last week. But I want to put this into perspective for Barbadians listening online, our citizens living in the diaspora, because I know a number of them, whether they're in New York or London or Canada or in the Caribbean, are tuned in. So I want us to, as I said, as I refocus the debate in line with what our leader did earlier today, and what my colleagues will do, I want to repurpose this debate into the context of which it ought to be delivered. Now, notwithstanding the significant global headwinds that we face as a country, Mr. President, notwithstanding the incredibly choppy external waters that we find ourselves, and those external waters can be the massive environmental issues relative to climate, it can be issues relative to supply chains, it can be relative to issues of high levels of interest rates in the international financial markets, all things that we have no control of, but yet we have a mandate to deliver for our people. And therefore, the government met and we decided that this is the package, not just for this government spending, but government spending toward the objective of ensuring that the economy can be on a strong footing. And as we grow in a way that is sustainable, a way that is inclusive, and that all of the tiers of our society can grow as we do so as well. And I really want to treat to a number of things here as I start my intervention in today's debate, Mr. President. Notwithstanding those global shocks I mentioned, the climatic shocks, we are in a world where there are wars and rumors of wars. And we're in a situation where, despite all of those things, this little country called Barbados was able to grow its economy last year by 4.4%. This economy, Barbados, and I want you to listen to me, all those who are listening, particularly those online. We have seen in our economy 11, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 consecutive quarters of growth in our economy. Consecutive. And when you look at the fact that we're almost at the end of the quarter, I am here to say, Mr. President, sir, that from all reports, we will have 12. This week, we look at the 12 disciples of Jesus. We're talking about the 12 consecutive quarters of growth. And Mr. President, sir, not from this side, though. Yeah. One just walked up. Anyway, let me keep it focused. But Mr. President, sir, one of the things we all know our recent history, and repeat this, we all know our recent history in Barbados. In 2018, the people of Barbados decided it fit in the interests of all of us to relieve ourselves of the burden from the Democratic Labour Party. And in 2022, they saw it fit again to ensure that they don't come anywhere near the public purse, given what they did between 2008 and 2018. We all know that history. And the Labour Party has decided that instead of driving and looking through the rearview mirror, we will govern and we will focus on the task at hand and task ahead. And you don't get distracted by the noise and the little comments, etc. But Mr. President, there are times in our history where we have to remind people of their past, when they want to believe that they can, and perhaps, Senator Nichols, you can correct me from the term because I left law school a while ago, but there's a maxim where it says, those who come to equity must do so with what? Clean hands. And therefore, I was incredibly shocked today, Mr. President, when I could hear what, in my view, is an honorable member of this chamber trying to lecture our people on what should be constituted in an estimate that would be inclusive, that would be fair, that would renown to the ordinary man on the street. But I can go back to 2008 to 2018 to remind them and those who want to hear. How many of you, in its broad terms, remember that you had families, and particularly painfully mothers, who had to decide if they were going to continue their education at the University of the West Indies, or if they're going to send their son or their daughter, or in many situations, both. That was the reality which we lived in. And I go further. When we came to office in May of 2018, Barbados was in a situation where the Democratic Labour Party, which is Senator Watson's party, and Senator Waters' party, and I wish that she were in her chair to hear this, but hopefully as she goes home, she's listening on the radio, and I say this, yeah, she's not in the chamber, shame, but what do you expect? I remind the public.
Senator Blackman, I would encourage you not to go beyond the facts as they are. Honourable members will not be in their chair from time to time, but I don't think that you are in a position to make an explanation for them as to where they are or what they're doing without the facts. Press on, please.
Mr. President, I take note and I accept your wisdom and your guidance.
And you've done so respectfully.
Absolutely,
as well.
absolutely.
I'm not talking.
And I'm glad that my words somehow in the wind picked it up and encouraged the honourable member to return. Yes. Now, in May 2018, I want to remind the public, Mr. President, sir, that the Democratic Labour Party, and as I said, I'm going through these things bit by bit before I get into the substantive part of my ministry's work, because I want to remind the public, as I said, that those who come to equity must do so with clean hands. And the Labour Party will not be lectured on these things in circumstances where for 10 years, many men and women had to hold their proverbial belly to come here ends meet. Because why? You had a group and a party that are licking up and breaking up and hiding up, whilst ordinary people could not put bread and butter on their table. But we don't want to come in here and lecture people on these things. No, 2018 May, Democratic Labour Party left only $220 million in foreign reserves. If you fast forward to yesterday, not last month, not last week, not last year, yes, today, the Barbados Labour Party, under the Barbados Labour Party, we now have $1.6 billion in foreign reserves. And let me break it down. Since we're not talking about the ordinary man, as we should, let us do so. What does it mean for the ordinary man, those figures? In 2018, $220 million left in foreign reserves. $1.6 billion as of yesterday under the Labour Party. It means that the country now has the capacity that whatever goods and services we want to purchase on their behalf, we have just over 7 months of the ability to do so. In circumstances where you had only 5 to 6 weeks under the Democratic Labour Party in 2018. These things matter. So therefore, if you wanted to go to Popular and buy a tin of sardine or corned beef, the country in 2018 of May only had the ability to do so for goods and services for 5 to 6 weeks. And we were on the precipice of disaster. But I've not heard anything today from the Democratic Labour Party that would explain to people how they could have done that. 6 years passed and they can now pretend as if they can come to the public with clean hands. It cannot work, Mr. President. Because why? Barbadians are incredibly intelligent, and I'm proud to associate myself with my people who have demonstrated the wisdom of ensuring that we will never repeat the atrocities that happened to us before. But everyone in a democracy, we're not stopping anybody from associating with any party. That is the true nature of the democracy. So notwithstanding that your party can have a convict, these are facts, I'm not making it up. A person who took rest in the United States penitentiary system We are not telling people not to associate themselves. That is their choice. But if you're going to come here in a situation where you are going to advance the interests of people. But I go further. Between 2008 to 2018, as I said, I'm going back to come forward, 23 downgrades from the international credit rating agencies. 23. Between 2018 and now, only upgrades. And I want to put this in further context, because when they were in office, they always talked about, you know what, the global financial crisis, the global financial crisis, the global financial crisis. We had COVID, the biggest and unfortunately most disruptive external shock you could have ever imagined within 102 years. And whilst we were going through that, we were able to still provide for our people, notwithstanding an IMF program that we're in. As a result of the mismanagement of the Democratic Labour Party, might I add, we were still able to give salary increases to our people, ensure that they had the necessary space to ensure that they can provide whilst the tourism was down during COVID. This is what we were able to do. But when we talk about debt, and I hear the commentary in and out of the chamber on the context of debt, when we came to office, the Democratic Labour Party had debt in this country at 178.9% of GDP, which invariably, and I heard the honourable member referencing the figure, rightly so, 68 cents of every dollar. Now you have a situation under the Labour Party. We've now been able to reduce it to 114.6% of GDP and declining as well as of February of this year, which is 30 cents of every dollar. Now, what does that mean, again, for the ordinary man? It means that in 2018, when we came to office and we rescued Barbados from the Dems, of every dollar that this country earned, 68 cents had to go to service our debt. In other words, if my math served me correctly, the other 32 cents had to go to provide the goods and the services, the roads, fixing all the infrastructure, buying books in schools, providing health care for our people. What was left was minuscule as a result of the debt that they wrapped up. Now, we have 30 cents of every dollar as debt. In other words, we now have 70 cents to be able to now build out our economy, provide for our people, build out the infrastructure, create opportunities for young entrepreneurs. And this is where we've now come from in 6 short years, whilst being on an IMF program and having to endure COVID for 3 to 4 years and still ensuring that we can provide for our people. But we would have heard also, in my view, what is an own goal through the honourable member. And the chamber was being told today, Mr. President, that we are now having to fix issues relative to stations for our police, who do a tremendous job, might I add, fixing of schools and roads. But it is an admission of the highest order. An admission of the highest order that when they said, as they claim, was 10 glorious years, clearly they were living in their own planet, probably off of Culpeper Island somewhere up there. But during that period, when they claimed that they were in 10 glorious years, why didn't they fix the things for our policemen and women? No, but that's what we're doing. Mr. President, I will address you. But the fact is, our programs, if you go in the estimates, you will see that we are doing those things now. Because why? The economy is growing. We've put the economy on a stabilization platform. And now that we're going to enjoy some more growth, we are going to make sure that all of our areas and our people can be taken care of. Because they don't like to talk about that lost decade. They don't like to hear it. But the facts are the facts. And you cannot change the facts. But as you look around Barbados, and the honorable member, leader of government business, spoke about it this morning. Wherever you go in Barbados now, you're driving on smooth roads. To the point where even some guys in a rural community I was in this weekend, they said, Mr. Blackman, sir, can we play some road cricket? If you know those days, Mr. President. Those hard roads, when they're serviced, make good road cricket. Because why? They said the road's smooth. The ball can come on onto the bat. And I said, well, I would recommend that perhaps you use the passer that you have over there to do so. But the point I'm making is this. Things are happening again. The international investment community is coming back to Barbados in their droves. And I'll get to that a little further in my presentation. But I must admit, the biggest shock for me, and I'm eagerly looking forward to hearing the presentation from the Honorable Member Senator Walters, because perhaps I'm sure he will correct his colleague in what was said. Because I was completely shocked and confused when I heard the scoffing at the fact that the Barbados Labour Party was able to, for the first time, implement a national minimum wage for our people. First time. And for those of you listening in your cars,
Senator Watson.
On a point of order, the Honorable Senator is misleading the House as to what I said. I said nothing about the implementation of a national minimum wage. I spoke about what is being given now as an increase and the effect that it will have on those low-wage workers when inflation continues to run rampant. It is misleading. He said something that I did not say.
Senator Blackman, please continue.
Mr. President, sir, by her own admission, it was the Labour Party who implemented, and we are now increasing it. And therefore, we take pride on behalf of the ordinary people of this country to be the party, to be grandly added to this party that looks out for the interests of the ordinary man in this country. And let's face it, and I'm glad that we touched on this point, and I'll touch on it very briefly. Say what you like, our borough contributed to this country. And I'm shocked that the people who are in his party and carry the party's name that he formed are nowhere near or even remotely associated with the legacy and principles that he stood for. So don't come. Don't come. Mr. President, sir.
Please adjust the chair. You can't start unless I'm here, so if ask me that, I may very well not.
Mr. President, sir, as always, I follow in your guidance and instruction. No, not at all, not at all, not at all.
You don't do black hair, they show this side.
But I really want to focus on that point, because why? A minimum wage is not just an academic exercise, or it's not an exercise where simply you're saying, okay, we are going to do this, and it's some window dressing out. No, this matters to people. Because if you are in an economic bracket where you already don't make a huge salary in the grand scheme, that will make a difference when you go into the supermarket and you have to determine, do I buy this chicken or these pieces of fish? Do I send my children to school? Can I pay my bills? Mr. President, they can stoop as much as they like, but I will say it. And you know what is very interesting, I will never forget, there was a friend of mine, and we, you know, in this Barbados, and long may it be so, we all have friends on both sides. We disagree, but we have friends on both sides. But he said to me, he said, Chad, one of the things that we always did, and we've created a strategy when you were in office between 1994 and 2008. Mr. President, he said to me, you can't beat the Labour Party when it comes to the economy. So what we did, these are his words, is that we created this thing that Barbados is more than an economy, it's a society. And as I listened to the utterances on the other side, I realize even more and more that that philosophy holds true. Whenever the Labour Party is in office, the economy of Barbados performs well. Whenever the Labour Party is in office, the indicators, not by our own measurements, but the international community, the indicators show real growth, not our figures, and they can't take it. But the facts are the facts. But I go on, Mr. President. When you look at the issue of the middle class, and I heard comments about not enough being done from the middle class. One, I want to start on the basis, again, of reminding that we are still coming out broadly of the adjustment period. Yes, we had the stabilization, and we're now seeing growth. But if you read these estimates, anyone, if you take the time to read the estimates, you will see a government that has committed spending to ensuring that the different sectors are touched, and also in the middle class, there are things done to ensure that we can also ensure that they can have some elbow room to play some shots in their household. And when you look at what we've been able to do, persons between the categories of $25,000 to $75,000, that bracket, they got reprieve as a result of the negotiations led by government with the retail sector to hold down prices, and that falls under the Honorable Leader of Government Businesses Ministry. This is a fact. In the civil service, Mr. President, sir, you've also seen the situation, and I would have alluded onto that before, the fact that we've been able to give salary increases, 3 within 6 years. This is what we've been able to do. And as on top of that, the first $350,000 off of property taxes were taken off, which is now also done relative to all taxes together with respect to that. But I want to now focus my attention to the estimates themselves, because these estimates, to my view, as I mentioned at the onset, focus a lot on not just the economy in its broad context, but it is one that is underscored by growth, by resilience, by inclusivity across all sectors of our country. And the idea, therefore, is that these estimates serves to unlock the potential of our country, a country that has had to unfortunately endure many atrocities, many of them inflicted domestically in terms of the previous government, but also, in fairness and reality, the external shocks that, as I mentioned, we have no control of. And the idea is now, how do we, as we grow, and the signs are there, that we create a framework through our government spending to ensure that we put the economy on a strong footing, provide for those in our society, and do so in a way that is building resilience and also ensuring that they can prosper sustainably. Now, we have heard a lot of talk in and out of the chamber on the issue of closing the deficit. And I think the Honorable Senator Watson would have alluded to that in her presentation. And I want to say, Mr. President, I am not sure if she did, so I'm prefacing my words very carefully. I'm not sure if the Honorable Member did, but in my view, it behoves us as honorable members of this chamber that if you're going to come in here, they were not created to give us weights and aerobics lessons, Mr. President, sir. They were created for us, okay? Well, if they're in virtual form and digital form, even better. No excuse. The point is, these things were made for us to read. And I would have imagined that the honorable member, having had sight, whether in digital form or in print, looked at Table 8, Mr. President. Table 8 Let us go through it. I know we have a long evening, but it is incredibly important that the public understands who we are dealing with and where we want to take this country and why we must not be distracted by smoke and mirrors and innuendo. These are real matters for real people. Mr. President, sir, allow me to read from this document. How is it going to be financed in deficit? And I'll go through some of them. From the domestic side, debentures, 100 million. Treasury bills, 100 million. Boss bonds plus, 200 million. Series J bonds, 100 million. And as they call it in the other category, 128 million. Now let us go, and I think this was mentioned before, from the International Monetary Fund, 227 million. The Inter-American Development Bank, 102 million. Caribbean Development Fund, CAF, also known as the Latin America and Development Bank. They are here, Mr. President. So to come and ask how is it going to be done, to suggest as if the government doesn't know what it is doing or it is not there, it is not only wrong, but it finds no place in a modern democracy, as they like to talk about, with maturity. But I go on, because I know my other colleagues would treat a number of those issues. Mr. President, sir, within the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Investment, there is the whole aspect, and we've heard a lot about it, particularly from the leader of government business, the whole question of strategic planning. We've heard about the commitment for results and a customer service charter. Now, when we look at those areas, it is really about the ministry spearheading a coordination effort to ensure that, one, we streamline all of our operations to improving the service delivery of the ministry. And what is the objective of this? We're trying to ensure that as the ministry performs its function, its constitutional function, that it also meets the developmental needs of Barbados. And we're in a changing environment. We're in an environment where, as I said, our economy is more and more interwoven and intertwined with the international community, whether that be in CARICOM, via the single market and economy, whether that be with Europe, through the economic partnership agreement that we have, whether that be with CARIFORUM, of course, CARICOM plus the Dominican Republic, and we can go on. But the idea is that central to the ministry's purpose is also how do we engage with our other line ministries to ensure that as we seek, for example, technical assistance, that this can be done in a streamlined fashion and clear coordination, clear deliverables, clear timelines to be able to build out what we're trying to do. And as I said, the ministry serves as that interlocutor, that housing pot, as it were, to ensure that all of this is coordinated. And the Prime Minister has given each ministry, including the Economic Affairs and Investment, and the entire Ministry of Finance, Economic Affairs and Investment, the clear mandate, as you've heard, to deconstruct and to reconstruct. And what does that mean? We have inherited a system from the British that oftentimes we still look, or the procedures of what we have oftentimes still mirror those which were there from decades ago. And invariably, it bears no resemblance to a 21st century Barbados. And it bears no resemblance oftentimes to the needs of our people, particularly in the context of the digital era, timelines, time deliverables. And therefore, there is a mandate now for every single ministry in this country to ensure that we do an analysis of where we are and how do we ensure that our delivery is fit for purpose for our people. So I was heartened, and I'm heartened to be part of a government, and in particular in this regard, Business Barbados, led by the Honourable Member, Leader of Government Business, which, as its mandate, will seek to be that entity which will ensure that the ease of doing business in this country is fit for purpose. And I want to use this occasion also to laud the Honourable Member and her team, because why? Speaking in my capacity as the Minister for Investment, whilst we attract, and will continue to attract, and I'll speak to it a bit later, international investment, oftentimes there are some bottlenecks, and I think we've heard a lot of it today and elsewhere. There are oftentimes some bottlenecks that investors, when they come to this country, meet in trying to operationalize their business. But equally, this is not only about the foreign investor. This is also ensuring that our young entrepreneurs, or people who have to engage in business in this country, whether it be KIPO, can do so in a realm and a circumstance that allows for them to have a seamless experience and a seamless engagement with government services. So whilst many have scoffed at GovTech, I can tell you that there are a number of countries from the region, and I can also tell you a number of countries from Latin America and Africa who have reached out to us to say, we've heard over the last year your intention for GovTech, and given that Barbados continues to be a thought leader, we want you to now come and help us to see how we can implement that, given you're a small size as well. And this is the sort of legacy that we have as a country. But we must not take it for granted. We must not become complacent and think, this is Barbados, we do well, and therefore. Because there's a verse, and I like to quote it, and perhaps the Honourable Member, sorry? Of course, but you know that I used to preach, but anyway. Yes, you might be in church, that is true. But the fact is, we have a situation where that verse says, if you humble yourself, I will exalt you. But if you exalt yourself, I will humble you. And that must be who we are as a people. Confident, have the ability to grow, have the ability to lead, have the ability to influence around the world, but at the same time, remain humble as a people as we do so. But there are a number of partnerships which we also engage in that will build out our capacity, our relationship, for example, with the World Bank and then the IMF. And I must say, to their credit in the international architecture, things are not perfect, but the posture that they would have had decades ago has now changed tremendously. And I'm proud to be part, not just of government, but a country which continues to have significant respect in the international community, particularly the international financial community. Which leads me then to this point. We talk about cost of living. We talk about the fact that most of our cost of living is externally driven, and that is a fact. And therefore, if you see a problem that is external in nature, and ordinarily you have no influence to it, ordinarily, prima facie, what you do is that you try to get to the table of influence. And to its credit, as a government led by Prime Minister Motley, we have been able to identify broadly, and I'll categorize these three things. One, in the height of COVID, and coming towards perhaps the end of COVID, seeing the timeline maybe in a 2-year period at that time, the government realized that notwithstanding the deep inequalities that existed prior to the pandemic, there were a number of inequalities that grew larger. So it was almost like a wound. You had a wound, but because of the pandemic, that wound grew bigger. And therefore, given how the world was structured, and this is important to this debate on the estimates, because it tells you where we have to continue to go as a people. Given where we are in terms of our economic structure, small state, small open economy, might I add, given that our external realities drive our domestic space, as it were, COVID brought us the attention that these inequalities must be addressed. And how did we go about to do it? I remember at the time, I was our ambassador in Geneva. Madam Deputy President was our PR and ambassador in New York. I think, Mr. President, you were in Canada at the time. But the government set out a course to host the first UN conference post-COVID. What are we talking about? UNCTAD 15. And what was the significance of that? UNCTAD is the institution in the entire UN system which treats to the issue of trade and it treats to the issue of development. And therefore, the Bridgetown Covenant, which was the outcome document of that, set out a course on where the world needed to go because the institutions that govern the world broadly were made in the image of nations that existed around the time of World War I and II, and most countries were not independent at the time. And in other words, COVID presented the opportunity for us to say we need to have a world system that reflects modern times, modern nations, and modern aspirations. But we go further. When we talk about cost of living, we also have to talk about supply chains. I mentioned it before. And therefore, whilst we may think, here I am, or here we are in Barbados, or what happens in Egypt, in the Suez Canal, may have nothing to do with me, or what happens just over 2 hours in the Panama Canal may have nothing to do with me. Nothing could be further from the truth. Because why? International trade and its connectivity determines so many things that come through our spending and purchasing power and what we buy at the cost thereof. And in order to follow that mandate that we've now set ourselves as a country, as a government, we went after the idea and hosting of the first ever Global Supply Chain Forum, which will be held where? In Barbados in May of this year. And this is what I'm talking about. This is what, in my view, and this is my first estimate, I must confess, but this is what I believe an estimates debate ought to be about. How do you, or we rather, as a people, as honorable members of this chamber, take the debate not only in treating to the ordinary man, but taking them along the journey of showing them why things are the way they are, where are the challenges, but equally where are the opportunities to treat to these challenges in a sustainable and legal way on the international scene. And this is the role of this government. But I want to move on a bit further. When you talk about transformation, and I want to wear my previous hat, my ILO hat, and it's clear that you can see it on a day-to-day basis, Mr. President, sir, where the world is going, the skills required for Barbados to continue to enjoy the way of life and the quality of life that we so enjoyed and taken pride. If we are to continue to provide that quality of life, it will require skills of us that oftentimes may not necessarily be at our disposal today. But what does that mean and what does it look like? It means, and this is why I'm happy, even though they talk about it, they call it what, tinkering? In order for Barbados to continue to be the world leader it is in its weight class, an intellectual thought leader, we have to transform our educational base. Because why? Those skills don't just pop out of the sky. And I understand the natural inclination for those who have benefited from a system that is based on colonial frame and elitism. But the truth is that I can tell you, and Mr. Speaker, I say so humbly, given where I sat as the senior advisor to the Director General of the ILO, International Labour Organization, I can tell you that the skills required for our people, we have to transform our education system, have to. If not, we're going to be left with an empty bag in our hand. But now is the time to do so. Now is the time to do so. So therefore, I expect going forward, whether in here or in outside or online on social media, that the discourse around educational transformation is not seen as a political football, but one of national developmental priority. Because that is a level of maturity that we must come to where we're treating to these things of our national development. So, whether it be in robotics, whether it be in digital transformation, whether it be in foreign languages, whether it be in technical and vocational training. And I really want to be more on that point, because whilst the traditional model that we broadly model ourselves on in having university education, there's nothing wrong with that, the next wave of development will require for us to be able to own the intellectual means of economic production around the world. And what does that mean in broad terms? Barbados, right now, because of our educational system, and whilst we're transforming, there's still some advantages that we have that we must tap into. We have the ability to make Barbados a knowledge-based economy. An economy that looks around the world to see what are the challenges that other countries are having, whether it be in climate, whether that be in health, whether that be in infrastructure, challenges relative to, you name it. And based on our educational system, backed by intellectual property, the country becomes the global hub of ideas. In other words, we don't have any gold, any bauxite, any large gold, any large oil, Mr. President, sir. But our gold and our bauxite is in our brain, our creativity. And one of the things is that notwithstanding, and I've seen it, societies who broadly have had to endure significant levels of hardship over centuries, wrapped up in their bones, wrapped up in their being, is a level of creativity and ingenuity that ordinarily they would not have had if they were not in that situation. So whilst it is an unfortunate set of realities that we've had to endure as a Caribbean people, wrapped up in our bosom is that level of creativity, because why hardship forces you to find ways to do things. And we must pivot with that and turn that into a knowledge-based economy where Barbados, and by extension the region, becomes the knowledge hub of the world, exporting our ideas. And equally, saying to the rest of the world, Barbados is the place where you come and you test your ideas. You come and you work and you build it. Because let's face it, the country has to also face the reality that we have to grow our population. It is not a topic that oftentimes people like to admit or talk about, but in the maturity of our country, it is something that we have to really, really, really focus on. Because why? If we are to largen our prospects and our pool for development for our people, we have to grow our size. And as you grow your size, you grow the ability to attract more investment, more business, and the likes as well. But I go a bit further. When you talk about digital transformation and the economic side of things, it is not only about getting a document and putting it into digital form. We're not just talking about scanning a PDF and putting it online and saying, no, no, no. We are talking about a true transformation of digital processes. And I want to commend the work of MIST and the minister leading MIST. Because why? We are talking about changing an entire culture that we've had to live post-independence. But we find ourselves in a world and reality where all around us, all of our trading partners, all of their processes are wrapped up in digitalization. And we must be not just a part of it, but we have the ability, in my view, to lead on that as well. And I go further. When we talk about digital, we also have to, and we cannot have a debate and talk on digital and the economy without the impacts of artificial intelligence. I've spoken on this a few times since I moved back to Barbados, but I want members to cast their mind to the reality and a real example, and I know the Honourable Member, Senator King, will be interested in this. In film, we all know Tyler Perry, or know of, rather. And a few weeks ago, whilst he was on to expanding his firm, the production firm, to invest $800 million US, 800 million. He stopped. Why? Because he realized, and this is for our young people and our tech as well, that these devices that we now have can produce even higher quality of movies than a big big production company, taking up hectares and hectares of land. So therefore, he stopped his 800 million. That's one of the most fascinating and also mind-boggling things that I've heard in a while. So therefore, it presents us with an opportunity. How do we get our young people and our people generally in Barbados and the Caribbean? We have our own stories, we have our own rhythm, we have our own culture. To be able to use the technology, it's not just, you see, the debate on artificial intelligence has become so much about ChatGPT. It's much bigger than that. How do we get them to pivot in that direction? How do we get our economy now to move in the direction of creating a new economic class? Because we're small enough, and in my view, if you're talking about the ordinary man, we must be able to create, Mr. President, a situation in Barbados where once you can conceive it, Barbados becomes that conduit that allows you to do it. You may have some challenges along the way, you may have some obstacles, but we must get into the mindset of it can do and not it can't do as a society. And therefore, as we look at the issue of really creating an economy, not only that punches above its weight, not only that gives good GDP figures, yes, absolutely we're doing that. Creating growth, yes, we're doing that. We expect high levels of growth, absolutely. But we must become that small global economy that continues to be a thought leader, not just on climate, not just on reparations, not just on our Africanness, but an economy that can provide solutions for every global economy. Because why? We have the DNA wrapped up. And as I close, how much time do I have allotted to me left? 10 minutes, okay. And as I go into my conclusion, there are three things I want to focus on, I'll wrap up with. Economics is not only a discipline in which you study, it is not only a discipline in which you engage at university, it is a lived, it's what is social science. It is a lived reality for people. And over the next few months, the team in Economic Affairs and Investment, we will be launching some public skits where you can watch on your phone or GIS, CDC, you name it, helping people to demystify a lot of the jargon that we use, but also going further, helping them to understand how can I, John Brown, Mary Sue, Bob Clark, Abdul, whatever your name, how can I play my part in the economy of Barbados? What do I need to do to be able to tap into it? What are the options? And the good thing is that you don't therefore have to now go to a class, as it were, to understand and engage. You can do it from your phone. And those skits will be guiding people with the demystification of a lot of the jargon and etc., but showing them also the opportunities. So when we sign on to the international trade agreements which we have, how do those trade agreements and the EPA benefit the man down Vauxhall, where I'm from, or down Brandon's? How can he or she be further be a part of that economy? And not just to be a small entrepreneur, you may start there, but we have to create the appetite amongst our people for them to be global entrepreneurs and businessmen and women. Because why? It must not only be that billionaires must come from the global north. This is what we are talking about. So these estimates are not just the annual exercise of laying it in Parliament and we approve and we go home. No. This, Mr. President, sir, in my view, is really about how do we ensure that government spending helps us to grow, helps us to prosper, helps us to be sustainable, and also help our people to unlock their innate, trapped up abilities that God has blessed them with. That is what, in my view, the legacy of these estimates, 2024-25 will be. And then the last point I want to make is that as we grow, and I look forward to this day, and you may say, Minister Blackman, Senator Blackman, Chad, the Honorable Member, whatever you choose. Well, I shan't respond on air. But in all seriousness, Mr. President, it must also be about And this is where I see Barbados going. Notwithstanding our small size, notwithstanding our limited resources at this time, I want to see a Barbados where not only we provide solutions around the world where we earn income, but I also want to see us reach to a society and a level that our books in the future can also be of assistance to other nations. So just like how other nations now have international aid programs, and it's not for vanity, it is I truly believe, and this is me speaking now, from my heart, I truly believe that as part of a modern society, a society that sadly had to endure the atrocities of slavery, that we also, and unfortunately, we were the headquarters of that slave empire, we have a duty to ensure that those around the world who need help, who need guidance, that we can help them as well. And irrespective of whoever's in office, that must be who we are as a people, because Barbados is a country that has always looked after everybody that they can. And we must not waver from that. So with those words, few words, Mr. President, I once again want to commend the Honorable Leader of Government Business. I want to commend the government for presenting these estimates, because I truly believe that they present an opportunity for us to finally take off on the economy and providing that quality of life and better life for our people that we so want to give for everyone. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Blackman.
Revert to announcements.
But we have announcements. It is, as you would recall, this is in relation to the committee of selection. And part of the procedural matter to allow us to make some necessary changes. The committee of selection, as you will be aware, is a sessional select committee that's appointed at the beginning of every session. This was done, of course, reflecting the interests represented in the honor of the Senate, and it is the mechanism empowered to nominate senators for all of the various sessional select committees of Parliament. At the beginning of the session, the 4th of February 2022, there were at that time no opposition senators, and the committee therefore reflected the nominated, the senators who were nominated based on the composition of the Senate at that time. Of course, on the 7th of February 2024, pursuant to that, in terms of our last appointment, February the 7th, 2024, Senator Chad Blackman was appointed to the committee. And then on February the 13th, 2024, two opposition senators were appointed. To recognize a change in this composition, we have to do two things. We have to revoke the appointment of Senator Blackman, because remember the composition reflected the composition of the Senate at that time, and we then have to appoint an opposition senator. My advice is that would be Senator Watson. Once I'm going to put the question, and if this is approved by the Honorable Senate, the composition of the committee then would be the President of the Senate ex officio, Senator Cummings, Senator Dr. Haynes, Senator Kevin Boyce, and Senator Tricia Watson. So the question is that we revoke the appointment of Senator Blackman on the committee selection in favor of the appointment of Senator Tricia Watson. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The next, the ayes have it. The committee of selection is therefore now composed, as indicated earlier, which is the President, Chairman ex officio, Senator the Honorable Lisa Cummins, Senator Dr. Bristol Haynes, Senator Kevin Boyce, and Senator Tricia Watson. Just by way of reminder, this, your concurrence this afternoon allows the committee of selection to meet and make changes across all the other committees whose composition reflected the composition of the Senate before the appointment of the two opposition senators. So we'll have a report back to the Senate with the proposals of the nominations committee to complete that process of incorporating the full participation and representation of our two opposition senators into the committee structure of the Honorable Senate. So you will note as well, the way that the independent senators are represented, opposition senators and government senators. In the interim, therefore, senators with particular interests in service and so on could speak to their respective colleagues on the committee to ensure that when we do meet, that the members of the committee are fully seized of preferences and interests and those matters, that there would be every likelihood of concurrence with the recommendations when they are put before the committee. So, and again, to remind, this committee is empowered to make nominations to the Senate. The Senate approves. So it is not that you are ceding your power and authority to the committee. The committee makes its recommendations and they come back here for your approval before taking effect. So thank you very much for your cooperation, and we will meet in short order to make the necessary recommendations.
Revert to public business, sir.
We revert to public business. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move the suspension of this sitting of the Honorable Chamber until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, March 26, 10 a.m.
Just a reminder before we put the question, a suspension is not an adjournment. There is no notice to go out to remind you that you're due to be here. And also there are very specific rules as far as the time limits within which a quorum must be formed, that we can get on with the business of the Honorable Senate. Remember also that the outer limits of the debate are designed so that all members have the right of maximum time to speak, and that any truncating of the hours in a day infringes on the rights of those members that have the maximum time for engagement in the process. So please be guided accordingly. The question is, don't worry about that. That's a different matter. The question is that the Honorable Senate, the sitting be suspended until 10 a.m. tomorrow. All Honorable Senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it. The sitting stands suspended until 10 a.m. tomorrow.